I, Samwell Tarley, humbly set quill to parchment to reshape the chronicle of our realm, so that those who come after may know the greatest truth that Westeros has ever held close to its beating heart. Let it be said that I undertake this task not out of vanity, nor out of some soft-hearted devotion to my dearest friend, but out of a solemn oath to preserve and celebrate the man who, in all my years of study, emerged as the purest, most unyielding champion of the realm. If the past histories are to be believed, they have recounted only fragments of this truth, some tinted by jealousy, others by ignorance, and still others by the blind fealty to tradition that so often muddies the waters of genuine scholarship. But I, who have traveled from Horn Hill to the Wall, from the Wall to the Citadel, and beyond to witness both the living and the dead, can bear testimony that Jon, once Snow, then known by many names, lived a life more significant than kings, conquerors, or the old valiant knights of legend. I will rewrite this story for the edification of all Westeros, so that we might properly honor him and give him the place he deserves in our annals, that of a man who stood for us in our darkest hour, who embodied duty and sacrifice at every turning of the page, and who changed the history of these lands forever. I must begin in the place that first joined our paths, the Wall. When I was dispatched to the Night's Watch, a journey that I took most unwillingly, my father's stern command echoing in my ears, it was there I found him, a young man of uncertain parentage, weighed down by the name Snow. He was a bastard, so they said, and of the North no less. Yet from the moment I saw him in the courtyard, sword in hand, he seemed to be cast from a mold entirely different than those around us. Jon never boasted, never needed to prove his steel with brutish swagger. Instead, he showcased his worth by means of loyalty, protectiveness, and an iron will that I dare say no frigid wind of the true North could match. Even then, the others recognized his gift, his skill at arms. Some envied him, some resented him, but I stood in awe. He befriended me in my own timidness and displayed a kindness I had not often felt from men. As we learned the ways of the Watch, tending the ravens, patrolling icy ramparts, swearing vows that bound us for life, Jon's presence emanated a quiet, unspoken authority. Those days were neither easy nor free from danger. We were but green recruits, yet the looming threat of the White Walkers began to show itself in small slivers of horror and rumor. Corpses reanimated, rangers disappearing beyond the Wall. Shadows fell across the Black Brotherhood, and the precarious peace that had reigned for centuries seemed to tremble on the brink of collapse. Jon, always watchful, always bristling with an urgency he could scarcely contain, knew somehow that we faced an existential threat that would require more than old stories and half-remembered runes. I remember the night he and I spoke in hushed tones in a drafty corridor of Castle Black, the torchlight dancing across our pale faces. He insisted that something was coming, something ancient and malevolent, and that we must be prepared. Then and there, I realized that he had an insight that surpassed mere bravado. Jon, though he did not say it, was preparing himself to lead. He was forging himself into the shield that guards the realms of men. When Lord Commander Jeor Mormont recognized Jon's worth, placing him in positions of responsibility, it only confirmed what I and a few others had already perceived. Yet, even then, Jon's humility was as deep as the snows that covered the Wall in winter. He saw these as duties to be fulfilled rather than glories to be savored. I can recall countless nights when, after patrolling, he would linger in the library with me, glancing at the old parchments detailing the long night. He knew we faced something like that again, and he worried that we could not muster the unity to withstand it. Though he was as confident with a sword as any man of the Black Cloak, his heart was set on forging alliances, bridging divides, and unraveling the knowledge that centuries of neglect had buried. I often consider how his soul might have resonated if he had possessed a maester's chain. He had the curiosity for it. But Jon served his destiny in another way by standing at the fore, blade in hand, protecting us all. His travels beyond the Wall, during which he infiltrated the wildlings, led him to Ygritte, a woman whose fierce spirit forever changed Jon. It is in that chapter of his life that one sees the beating heart of his character. Ostensibly, his mission was to gather intel, but what he truly gleaned was a broadened view of the world. He saw men and women who lived outside the bounds of the Seven Kingdoms, free folk who might have been called savages, but possessed their own love, loyalty, and yearning for safety. In Ygritte, he discovered the complexity of love and duty, a conflict that would test him, wound him, and eventually shape him. I won't gloss over the pang of heartbreak that recurs in his story. Ygritte's death was a crucible of sorrow that nearly shattered him. But from those ashes, Jon gleaned yet a deeper compassion for all those who lived on the margins of our realm. When he returned to Castle Black, faced with the inevitable collision of the Free Folk and the Watch, it was his empathy that guided him as much as his duty. But these pages are meant to speak of his worth and how it soared far above what tradition ever allowed for one born in perceived bastardry. The king beyond the wall, Mance Rayder, was no small foe. Yet Jon, using a blend of diplomacy and raw courage, found a solution to the clash that would have ravaged both sides. It was a solution built upon trust. A trust that was not easy to secure in the hardened hearts of the Night's Watch, nor among the free folk who had every reason to despise the Crows. Nonetheless, Jon stood in the middle, forging a path that would allow them to unite against the deeper threat, the army of the dead, slowly marching behind snow-laden hills. To accomplish that, he endured lashings of doubt from his brothers, suspicions of treachery from his superiors, and the heartbreak of losing the woman he'd come to love. Still, he persevered. If that does not speak to a quality of leadership beyond the normal measure of men, I know not what does. In my rewriting of these events, I make it clear that while these choices might have looked treasonous to some at the time, they were the first steps in forging an alliance that eventually helped stave off the end of mankind. When Stannis Baratheon arrived, proclaiming himself the rightful king, and demanded fealty from both the Watch and the Free Folk, Jon navigated the precarious landscape with a level of nuance unexpected for one so young. He refused to bend the sacred vows of the Watch to serve any one lord, even if that lord wore the mantle of a king. In doing so, he risked angering Stannis, even as he offered the man counsel that could have shaped the fortunes of the North. Had fate and the gods been kinder to Stannis, perhaps we might have witnessed a more harmonious blending of efforts. But war in Westeros rarely bows to benevolence. Eventually, the brothers of the Watch turned on Jon for his perceived fraternization with the Free Folk. His murder was a sinister reflection of the realm's deeper failings, the inability to see beyond old hatreds and the destructive impulse of men who cling to custom at the cost of salvation. I still ache when I recall that dreadful night, the conspirators' blades flashing in the torchlight, the hush of betrayal hovering in the frigid air. I was not there in person at that final stroke, but the memory still sits in my chest like a shard of ice. They cut him down, and in their folly, they nearly doomed us all. Yet the gods, or the Lord of Light, or some power beyond our comprehension, had other designs. If the realm had not realized Jon's significance by then, the miracle that followed made it undeniably clear. Melisandre's strange incantations, her pleas to the fire, drew him back. He returned from the blackness of death, and in so doing, he was transformed into something more than a mere mortal. I do not claim to understand the intricacies of that magic, nor will I attempt to interpret the mysterious will of higher powers. But it is this moment that stands as a turning point in our collective story. Jon returned to us not just as a man revived, but as the very harbinger of life in the face of encroaching death. In truth, from that instant onward, the world should have bowed to him. But Jon, ever unassuming and steadfast, did not attempt to exploit his new lease on life. Instead, he fulfilled his final duty at the Wall. He brought justice to those who betrayed him, though that act weighed heavily on his spirit. Then, in one of those rare gestures that define an individual's soul, he resigned from the Watch. "My watch has ended," he declared, and indeed it had. He had died for the vows, returned from the darkness, and by that twist of fate was released from those vows. Here, dear reader, is a moment that confounds the simpler histories. Some have labeled Jon an oathbreaker, but they fail to grasp the metaphysical enormity of his resurrection. Let them reflect on this. Once dead, always freed. He had served. He had bled. He had died. Thus, he owed the Watch no more, and the realm had far greater need of him beyond the confines of black stone and ice. He turned his gaze then to Winterfell, the seat of House Stark, which had fallen into the clutches of House Bolton. Here is where the rightful heirs of the North should have governed, but instead it was under the boot of Ramsay Bolton, a fiend whose cruelty was whispered across every corner of Westeros. Jon did not march alone. Alongside him stood Sansa Stark, his half-sister, so many believed, though we now know the deeper secrets that would unfold, and the wildlings who had thrown their lot in with the only man who'd ever shown them compassion and acceptance. It was a ragged force, outnumbered, outarmed, and tested by the brutal winters of the North. But the faith the free folk placed in Jon was unshakable. They believed in him not just as a leader, but as someone who represented a fresh hope, untainted by the relentless infighting of great houses. The Battle of the Bastards was a calamity of mud, blood, and brutal chaos. Amid the swirling confusion, Jon seemed to stand at the center of the storm. I often imagine him there, sword in hand, searching the horizon for any advantage, any glimmer of hope. By all accounts, he came close to being trampled, close to being swallowed by the crush of bodies, but fate or cunning or sheer will delivered him. When the Knights of the Vale arrived, orchestrated by Sansa, the tide of the battle shifted. Ramsay fell, and Winterfell was reclaimed by the children of Ned Stark. Jon included, though he had not yet guessed how close his ties truly were. The North remembered, as it always does, and soon those proud lords who had once spurned Jon's call to arms bent the knee, anointing him king in the North. There, in the great hall of Winterfell, with the stone direwolves looking on as silent witnesses, a chorus of voices shouted, "The king in the North!" To a man they had long believed was not even a true Stark. The significance of this can never be overstated. Despite old prejudices, despite the skepticism many harbored, Jon's deeds had proven him worthy of more than any name. He had proven he was the one to guide them through the peril yet to come. As the unthinkable became reality and the army of the dead pressed closer, Jon began to move with urgency. He had the North at his back but knew that alone it would not be enough. The threat was too vast. He traveled south, forging new alliances, speaking with Daenerys Targaryen, who at the time seemed poised to conquer Westeros with her dragons. By then, rumors were rampant. Some said Jon sought to kneel to her, others that he sought her destruction. The truth was simpler. He sought her aid and the might of her dragons against the undead. He even ventured beyond the wall once more to capture one of those ghastly wights as proof of the threat. In that mad quest, he lost many brave men, including some of Daenerys' own. They endured the horror of seeing a dragon fall to the Night King, resurrected as a terror of ice and necrotic power. I cannot stress enough that none of this might have been possible without Jon's unwavering commitment to unifying the living. Westeros was fractured by centuries of war and grudges older than the Citadel's oldest tomes, yet Jon managed, through sheer integrity, to bring together enemies, forging them into allies in the face of a doom that threatened everyone, high or low, noble or common. The knowledge of Jon's parentage, which I uncovered in my research at the Citadel, was a revelation of monumental consequence. The union of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, once shrouded in secrecy, had produced a living heir to the Iron Throne. But I must note that Jon's acceptance of this truth was not accompanied by any lust for power or dominance. On the contrary, it burdened him further. How does one reconcile a lifetime of believing oneself a bastard with the sudden knowledge that you possess the most royal blood in the realm? Jon, who had always defined himself by duty and self-sacrifice, found his identity tested anew. The entire realm might have risen to name him its rightful king, but that was never Jon's singular goal. He had a duty, to unite the living against the dead. The pomp of court and the pageantry of monarchy were but distractions. Even as Daenerys Targaryen, with whom Jon formed a bond of mutual respect and, yes, love, took steps to claim the Seven Kingdoms, Jon's sights remained fixed on the near-apocalyptic threat. When winter came in earnest and the Night King's army made its way south, Jon stood at the vanguard of that climactic conflict. At the Battle of Winterfell, when the dead stormed the castle walls, when darkness threatened to devour every living soul within those ancient battlements, Jon fought like a man possessed. The hush that fell over the fields before that fight, the quiet terror of men and women steeling themselves for a hopeless stand, those are images forever etched into my memory. Many fell that night, including great warriors, loyal friends, and even one of Daenerys' dragons, but as always, Jon pressed on. He had led the living to this point, bridging the ancient animosities between houses, forging alliances with peoples once deemed barbaric or treasonous. And though it was Arya Stark's lethal strike that ultimately ended the Night King's reign, it was Jon's tireless leadership that made that possibility even conceivable. Without Jon, there would have been no unified force to defend Winterfell. The realm would have been torn asunder, conquered by a tide of undead. Though he did not land the killing blow in every conceivable way, that victory was as much Jon's as any in the realms. And yet, after that triumph, the realm's troubles did not abate. The Iron Throne still beckoned with its siren call of absolute power. Daenerys Targaryen, once the breaker of chains, suffered a tragic descent into paranoia and wrath as she neared the city that had spurned her family line. The siege and eventual sacking of King's Landing became an act of brutal devastation, one I believe neither Jon nor the realm ever truly recovered from. It pains me to chronicle these events, for they are a testament to how even the brightest hopes can curdle under the scorching weight of ambition and vengeance. Jon, horrified by the violence unleashed, wrestled with his loyalties as Daenerys descended into tyranny. The conflict within him was sharper than any blade he had ever wielded. Here was the woman he loved, whose strength and determination had once seemed a beacon. Yet she unleashed fire upon innocence, and the unstoppable might of her dragon laid waste to thousands. Perhaps some historians will view what Jon did next as a betrayal most grave. But I say to you, dear reader, that it was an act of love as much as duty. In the Red Keep, amid the wreckage and echoes of screams, Jon confronted Daenerys and ended her life. He chose the realm over his heart, cutting short the reign of madness before it could claim more innocent lives. He did so at immeasurable cost to himself, for it tore his soul in half. He had loved her, and still he drove a dagger into her heart, knowing that such a crime would forever mark him as a kinslayer and a traitor in the eyes of some. But how many thousands, or tens of thousands, were spared by that sorrowful act? The question is one that only the gods can truly answer. I only know that in every retelling I have gathered, Jon's demeanor in that final moment was not one of vengeance or cruelty, it was one of unutterable heartbreak and necessity. The price Jon paid for this was exile. He was sent north, once again beyond the wall, cast out by the lords and ladies who ultimately brokered an uneasy peace in the wake of Daenerys' death. But in truth, what place in the realm would have remained for him after such a sacrifice? I often wonder if he found solace in those frozen expanses, traveling with the free folk, the people who loved him for who he was, a man of honor, shield and friend to the voiceless. There, in the haunted forests and windswept plains, he may at last have found the only measure of peace available to him. Some say he still roams in the far north, wandering from one encampment to another, ensuring that no threat, living or dead, will ever again descend upon the realm unchallenged. His story is not one of a man content with glory. It is, instead, the story of a man shaped by duty, tested by love, and driven by a desire to protect others above all else. Why, then, do I, Samwell Tarly, choose to write this chronicle anew, in a way that exalts Jon beyond the customary telling? Because in studying the records, in speaking with those who fought beside him, and in pondering my own recollections, I realize that many historians have underplayed or distorted the significance of his actions. Some claim he was simply a convenient figure around which the North rallied. Others reduce him to Daenerys' consort, overshadowed by her dragons. And a few more cynically minded scholars question his resurrection, labeling it a trick or exaggeration. But the truth demands that we see him not as a footnote, but as the true moral center of our age. It is my belief that without Jon, without his capacity for love, for self-sacrifice, for forging alliances where none seemed possible, there would be no history left to write, for the dead would have consumed every corner of our world. Let me share some of the more personal gleanings I have gathered, which I fear may be lost if not set down. Jon's empathy was not a sign of weakness, but of a certain strength that transcended the usual measures of a warrior. When I cowered at Castle Black, flinching at the harsh taunts of our fellow recruits, Jon stepped in, gently, to coax me out of my fear, to remind me that I had worth, that I belonged in the Watch as much as any other. He was not the sort to ridicule or to bully, which set him apart even among those who claimed to be men of honor. And though he was not a scholar, his curiosity about the White Walkers and the mysteries of the old magic spurred me to dig into ancient manuscripts that had lain untouched for centuries. Often, he would sit quietly by the flickering candlelight as I read out passages about Dragonglass, about the last hero who united the first men against the dark. He listened with rapt attention, and I knew he was already plotting how best to act upon this knowledge for the good of all. It is in these small gestures that one sees the truest measure of Jon's character. Those gestures never wavered, no matter how his circumstances changed. Even after he was pronounced king in the north, or when Daenerys received him as an emissary, he carried himself with the same earnest humility. Titles meant little to him, except insofar as they allowed him to serve the realm more effectively. Pride and ego did not drive him, necessity did. When he bent the knee to Daenerys, it was not because he hungered for power, but because he believed it was the only way to secure her help against the Night King. So many lords, even in the face of annihilation, would cling to their pride, refusing to bow to anyone and thereby destroy their people in a blaze of short-sighted vanity. Jon, by contrast, made the practical choice, one that was deeply unpopular among some northern houses, but which saved countless lives when her dragons joined our fight. I do not mean to imply that Jon was perfect. As a friend and confidant, I knew him better than most, and I can say that he carried a mountain of guilt for every perceived failing, every death he could not prevent. He was a man haunted by the ghosts of the men he led. Even in the best of times, I sensed a certain sadness in his eyes, a shadow that hinted at burdens he could not put into words. He questioned his own decisions, his own worthiness. Yet, perhaps that constant self-examination was his greatest strength. He never assumed that he alone was right, never grew complacent. Often, in the War Council, his first impulse was to ask advice of those he trusted, to gather perspectives before reaching a conclusion. Tyrion Lannister once remarked in my hearing that Jon's humility was a political flaw, yet also what made him uniquely suited to unify disparate factions. Perhaps that is why so many flocked to him, including lords who had once been his enemies. They recognized something in him that was almost unnervingly genuine. We can contrast Jon with Aegon the Conqueror, or even with the Targaryen kings who followed. Those men made their mark through dragonfire and the forging of a grand empire under one iron throne. Jon's approach was subtler, more personal. He did not demand fealty, he earned it through action and sincerity. In a sense, he was a conqueror of hearts and minds, though he likely never intended such a thing. Though the official histories will list him as the king in the north for a brief span, many of us who witnessed his influence believe that he was, in truth, a king of the entire realm, a king not by decree, but by virtue of being the one who saved us when no one else could. Now that I serve as Archmaester, I often find myself turning the great astrolabe in the Citadel's library and recalling the moment I fully grasped his parentage. It was in a dusty nook amidst piles of scrolls that I pieced together the proof of Rhaegar Targaryen's annulment and subsequent secret marriage to Lyanna Stark. I recall my heart pounding at the enormity of what I had discovered. But it seemed to me then, as now, that Jon had always carried that secret in his bearing. He was the embodiment of ice and fire, a living symbol of the unity that the realm so desperately needed. And in a twist of irony that would have amused the old gods, the rightful heir to the Targaryen dynasty was none other than the man who refused to embrace the throne. The realm, in its infinite capacity for strife, ended up with a broken monarchy anyway, one reorganized under King Bran the Broken. But my mind is sometimes haunted by the question of how different things might have been had Jon's lineage been known at the proper time and in the proper way. Would Daenerys have been tempered by that knowledge? Would the lords of Westeros have united earlier under a new Targaryen banner that was less prone to the pitfalls of old resentments? We cannot rewrite the past, but we can record it truthfully so that the future might learn from it. I expect, of course, that my rewriting of this history will raise eyebrows among my peers at the Citadel. Some will accuse me of letting personal bias overshadow the rigors of scholarship. Others might question the sources I draw upon to elevate Jon's role so prominently. Yet, I have corresponded with lords and ladies from across Westeros, from the Eyrie to Dorne, from the Iron Islands to Old Town. I have spoken with Brienne of Tarth, Davos Seaworth, Tormund Giantsbane, and many others who have recounted Jon's deeds in detail. Their testimonies align to paint a portrait of a figure who emerged from obscurity to safeguard our entire civilization. No, my aim is not to produce a neutral, colorless record of events. My aim is to highlight those virtues that the realm too often forgets: loyalty, compassion, perseverance, humility, and love. For if these histories serve only to extol conquest and dominion, we shall forever repeat the mistakes that lead to war and heartbreak. Jon's story in the retelling becomes a blueprint for a nobler future if we have the wisdom to heed it. In the quiet hours of the night, by candlelight, I sometimes read parts of my manuscript to Gilly, who has lived these events by my side, albeit from a vantage outside the circles of noble power. She has her own perspective, having journeyed with me from Craster's Keep, survived the horrors of the long winter, and witnessed how Jon welcomed her and her child when so many would have turned her away. She reminds me, in her gentle way, that Jon's greatness often manifested in the small gestures: giving food to the hungry, forging safe haven for those deemed unworthy, standing watch through the night so that others might sleep. Those are the qualities that rarely end up heralded in songs or etched onto statues, but they are the bedrock upon which a realm can truly stand. We can hoist a king onto a throne and shower him with laurels, but if he does not feed his people when the harvest fails, if he does not see the value in every life, then what is the point of a crown? As I near the end of this extensive revision, I realize that Jon's tale is, in many ways, a tragedy tempered by hope. He sacrificed more than any man I have known. He was loved by multitudes, and yet he ended his days in exile, far from the warmth of hearth and home. He never claimed the throne that was, by blood, his right. But had he done so, could he have remained the man he always was? There is a paradox in that question. The realm is shaped by power struggles, but Jon was shaped by a desire to keep the realm alive, regardless of who wore the crown. In a sense, that made him the king Westeros needed but never fully embraced. Let this record be a step toward redressing that oversight. Let it be a testament so that, in centuries yet to come, when scholars and students of the Citadel open these pages, they may understand that a true leader need not be crowned, need not be enthroned, and may even walk away from power if it threatens to corrupt the very purpose for which he stands. Some will say that the age of magic is gone, that with the defeat of the White Walkers and the loss of the dragons, Westeros has returned to a mundane cycle of wars and politics. But I hold that Jon's life and deeds were a kind of magic, an example of how faith, love, and unity can bend the seemingly inexorable tide of darkness. Magic is not just in the conjurations of red priests or the breath of dragons. It is in the capacity of one person to unite the hearts of thousands in a single cause, to cast aside old hatreds in the name of survival. Jon did that. And as I finalize my chronicle, I find within it a glimmer of optimism that Westeros may yet find peace if we learn from his legacy rather than bury it under cynicism and outdated grudges. Before I place my signature upon this account, let me address any who would dismiss my work as fable or romanticized retelling. I have, indeed, chosen to highlight Jon's better nature, for that is what stands out most starkly in a land where cruelty and ambition often overshadow compassion. But I have not fabricated. The official records of battles, alliances, and royal decrees attest to his role. The testimonies of his allies confirm his motivations. The scars on the land itself, the blackened ruins of Harhome, the graves of Winterfell, the scorched walls of King's Landing serve as tangible reminders of the storms he weathered. If this is a fable, then it is the most intricately documented fable Westeros has ever seen. I fully expect that future maesters may add their own commentary or interpretations. They may point out that Jon did not always succeed cleanly, that luck or chance often played a part. But let it be remembered that in an age where the living waged war against death itself, luck is sometimes another word for heroism. In the far north, it is said the old gods still watch through the eyes of weirwood trees, their silent presence predating the Undulls, the Targaryens, even the first men. Whenever the winds sweep down from the lands of always winter, I think of Jon leading a small band of free folk through icy drifts, searching for a safe refuge, keeping watch with Ghost at his side. I think of how, in that wilderness, he might at last be free of the expectations and machinations that define so much of his life in the South. Yet even there, I know he cannot escape his own conscience. He will carry his burdens with him, quietly, as he always did, turning them over in his mind as the ravens circle overhead. Perhaps that is what gives me a measure of comfort, that if ever the realm is threatened again, Jon is out there, sworn to protect us in ways official kings never could. With these reflections, I close the final page of my revision, though the story itself is far from concluded. Jon's final fate remains an enigma. Some say he will return, others that he has found peace, still others that he might vanish into myth as figures of legend often do. But let no one doubt the enormity of his presence in our history. Let no one reduce him to the footnotes of a queen's conquest or the margins of a war among noble houses. He was the realm's shield, the quiet hero who stood firm when the darkness advanced. Therefore, may this new history stand as a testament to who Jon truly was and what he accomplished for all of us. To any who read this in the centuries to come, remember him not merely as Jon Snow or the king in the north, but as the man who emerged from the shadows of bastardy to guard the realms of men. If we preserve that memory, perhaps we shall honor him as he deserves and, God's willing, learn from him how to bind together, how to forgive ancient grudges, and how to endure the winters of our world without losing the warmth of our humanity. Thus do I, Samwell Tarly, set my name to these pages, beseeching the realm to embrace the truth of Jon's life, that our story might forever give thanks to him who held back the dead, who sacrificed crown and comfort alike, and who showed us how to be, at last, truly alive. I have often wondered how future generations might comprehend the tides of power, love, and tragedy that shaped our time, and how they might read these pages and glean some sense of the man Jon truly was beyond the dire warnings and halting myths. This continuation is not simply an addendum to what I have already laid forth, but a necessary expansion of those truths stitched together by my own recollections, the accounts of those close to Jon, and the written evidence I have gathered in my tenure as both Maester and, later, Archmaester at the Citadel. The realm has a habit of erasing or minimizing those facets of a life that do not fit cleanly into the songs of chivalry or the cautionary tales of throne and crown. In setting my quill to parchment yet again, I hope to unearth additional insight into this man who, by many measures, held the fate of Westeros in his hands, though he never once sought to wrap those hands around the gilded arms of the Iron Throne. I will begin by recalling certain events that, in the compressed telling of war and politics, are often lost. Though I have recounted already how I met Jon at Castle Black and found in him an unexpected ally against both the cruelties of other recruits and the biting cold of the Wall, I wish to dwell a while on the earliest days of our acquaintance. We were young men, both feeling discarded by the houses we hailed from. I being deemed unworthy by my father, and Jon, though loved by his father, always viewed as an outsider in Winterfell. There was in him a quiet wariness, as if he expected every greeting to contain some hidden barb, every friendly face to mask scorn beneath the surface. I believe he arrived at Castle Black determined to prove himself, perhaps not to others so much as to some inner critic that whispered he was unworthy of the Stark name. Many men arrive at the Wall to escape shame or justice, to disappear from the world that scorns them, but Jon came to the Wall still wearing the expression of someone who feels an unspoken calling. He joined the Watch as though it were the most natural next step for him. Even as a boy of barely more than 15 name days, his back was straight, his eyes alert, and beneath any uncertainties about his future, he possessed an uncanny determination I had not observed in other recruits. During that time, we all heard the rumors. Direwolves had been found south of the Wall, one for each Stark child in Winterfell. Jon's was an albino wolf with red eyes, a beast that should have been left to die by any pragmatic measure. Instead, Jon intervened, sparing the runt of the litter. I always believed Ghost was an outward reflection of Jon's own nature, calm, watchful, deadly when threatened, and yet capable of an unbreakable bond. In the courtyard, when the other recruits would jostle me or call me a craven, Ghost would sometimes observe from afar with a low growl, as though even the wolf understood that cruelty was intolerable in Jon's presence. To many crows at the time, it was a mild curiosity. Why was a bastard boy from the north allowed a pet dire wolf within Castle Black? But in truth, it was one of those subtle signs pointing to a grander destiny. At that moment, of course, none of us could have fathomed how truly grand his destiny was. Nor did I fully appreciate how restless Jon's spirit might become. His sense of righteousness was tested early, particularly when confronted with the plight of the free folk. I well remember how the word wildling was spoken with a sneer by seasoned brothers of the Watch, as if these men and women beyond the Wall were less than human. Jon, though he had grown up hearing these tales, was never so quick to adopt hatred. He witnessed their lives up close when we ventured north of the Wall under Lord Commander Mormont's leadership, and the seeds of empathy were planted in him. He once told me late on a winter's night that a man does not stop being a man simply because he is born on the other side of the Wall. That conviction would guide him again and again, turning enemies into allies at the very moments when the realm needed every breathing soul to stand together. But that sense of empathy clashed with the old ways. It was a notion many of our black brothers or southern lords could scarcely comprehend. It struck them as treasonous or naive. In the earliest days, though, Jon kept these thoughts guarded. He was only a steward, after all, not yet in any position to shape policy. Those days were overshadowed by small but alarming signs, the disquieting tales of the White Walkers, the disappearance of rangers, and the reappearance of their corpses in dreadful undead forms. We were all ill-prepared for what that meant. Yet Jon, more than most, took these threats to heart. He insisted there must be a deeper reason for the tales so carefully preserved in the oldest tomes, tales of Dragoglass and the Long Night. It was as though he could sense the looming calamity long before anyone else dared give it credence. I, for my part, buried my face in books, gleaning bits of knowledge that might help us survive. Jon was not as studious in the formal sense, but he would visit me at the library's flickering candles, asking me to read aloud the ancient texts about the War for the Dawn. His expression was always intent, as if weaving the stories of old with the dangers of our present. That synergy of learning and action was something he perfected, my words on the page, his sword in the field. A synergy that would define our efforts throughout the war against the dead. When he left to join Corran Halfhand in the frostbitten wilderness beyond the Wall, I recall an uneasy emptiness at Castle Black. He departed on a mission, but the sense among those of us who cared for him was that he might never return. Rumors later arrived that he had betrayed his vows by joining with the wildlings, falling in with the king beyond the wall, Mance Rayder. Some among the watch spat his name as though it were a foul taste on their tongues. Others, myself included, could not believe he would truly forsake us. I remember the Lord Commander, Gior Mormont, telling me that if Jon had switched sides, it was surely for a reason. We clung to that hope, but still, we could not guess how deep that infiltration would run. It was only later, in hushed conversations, that Jon revealed the complexity of his feelings toward the Free Folk and his bond with the fiery-haired Ygritte. We all have our turning points in life, our catalysts that reshape our perspective, and Ygritte was his. Her death left a scar on him that never truly faded. Even in the later years, when he knelt to Daenerys Targaryen or when he wrestled with the revelations of his parentage, you could see traces of that sorrow in his eyes, a sorrow that, in some strange way, fueled his empathy for all those who suffer under the weight of cruelty or war. Our next meeting after his return was bittersweet. The Watch was in chaos, battered by the threat of the wildlings, many among us seething with distrust. Yet once more, Jon's unwavering moral compass guided him. He brokered peace with Tormund Giantsbane and others, convincing even the hardest skeptics that the Free Folk were not our true enemy. He did so at enormous personal risk, for the hatred between our peoples was centuries old, embedded in every grain of ice that lined our battlements. Let no one pretend this was a smooth or simple process. Many crows spat at Jon's proposals, calling him a traitor. Some threatened to kill him outright for daring to bring the wildlings through the wall. Yet he persisted, always returning to the fundamental truth that we needed every living body to stand against the White Walkers. The gratitude he earned from the Free Folk was absolute. They admired him not because he was a Stark or a highborn knight, but because he stood by his word and honored their dignity in a way few Southerners ever had. For a time, it seemed as though events might pivot toward unity. Stannis Baratheon arrived at the Wall, claiming dominion over all of Westeros, and he recognized Jon's competence. Their interactions were marked by a guarded respect. Stannis was not a man given to warm embraces or fatherly guidance, yet I think he saw in Jon a certain reflection of himself, a leader who was relentless in his pursuit of what was just. Stannis's court, such as it was, burned with fervor for the Red Priestess's faith and almost fanatical belief in the Lord of Light. Jon, though not devout by nature, listened to Melisandre's words, no doubt intrigued by the glimpses of power she displayed. Yet he never knelt to Stannis. He recognized that the Night's Watch must remain neutral even as he saw opportunities to aid the Northby. Why cooperating with the self-proclaimed king? It was a dance of politics, a subtle interplay that Jon never relished but accepted as necessary. How many nights did he confide in me, or in Dolorous said that the needs of the realm outweighed the comfort of dogmatic traditions? Then came the ultimate betrayal. No matter how many times I revisit that scene in my mind's eye, the horror remains as fresh as the day we learned of it. Jon had returned from Harhome, having witnessed the massacre of Free Folk by the Night King and his legion of undead. He was desperate to save as many people as possible, to raise defenses, to call the lords of Westeros to arms. But the old hatreds and petty loyalties in the Watch ran too deep. Men he considered brothers, men he had fought alongside, lured him outside under pretense and plunged their daggers into him. Their whispered words for the Watch still echo in the corners of my mind. The cruelty and irony of it, that the man who most embodied the very ethos of the Watch should be slain by those who claim to uphold its honor, is a lesson in how fear can poison honorable institutions. They were terrified of his vision, terrified of the wildlings within our walls, terrified that Jon was indeed forging alliances that might upend their world. And so they murdered him in cold blood. To this day, I believe that act was as grievous an error as any in the annals of the Watch, perhaps second only to the initial failure to heed the White Walker's return centuries ago. Yet the gods, or some power beyond mortal comprehension, were not done with Jon. Melisandre, who had for so long prophesied about a prince that was promised, sought to invoke her Lord of Light to bring Jon back. In a moment that still baffles me, that defies the logic I absorbed at the Citadel, Jon drew breath again. He stood as though awakened from a dream of shadows, his mortal wounds knitting themselves into scars. Whatever force moved through Melisandre that night changed the very fabric of our reality. Never again can any maester look upon the world and dismiss tales of magic as fables. Jon's resurrection was a sign that the deeper currents of fate and prophecy had chosen him for some higher purpose. And yet his own reaction was not triumph or exultation. It was horror. He had felt the black emptiness of death. He had been stabbed by those he trusted. That night he parted ways with the Watch, declaring that his watch had ended. For a time, I thought that moment might free him entirely, that he could walk away from the burdens of leadership and live as a man unshackled. But his sense of responsibility ran too deep. Even if he was no longer bound by vows, he was bound by conscience. His gaze then turned toward Winterfell, where the Bolton banners hung and Ramsay's cruelty held sway. Sansa Stark's reappearance and her plea for Jon's help served as a catalyst. Despite the state of near despair, the North rallied around him in ways I doubt even he anticipated. The memory of Ned Stark and the injustices done to House Stark kindled anger in the hearts of the Umbers, the Mormonts, the Glovers, though not all answered his call initially. The resulting campaign, known to history as the Battle of the Bastards, was a battle that saw the North's darkest hour. Ramsay used every deception, including the murder of poor Rickon Stark, to draw Jon into a catastrophic charge. I can recall standing upon the ramparts of Winterfell in the aftermath, witnessing the churned mud and the piles of bodies, realizing that we had come inches from total annihilation. But Sansa's intervention, securing the Knights of the Vale through Littlefinger, turned the tide. The Bolton ranks collapsed, and Jon reclaimed Winterfell in the name of House Stark. That moment, when the northern houses gathered in the Great Hall, hailing Jon as the king in the north, remains one of the most stirring recollections I carry. The lords of the north, famously stubborn and prideful, nevertheless recognized in Jon the qualities of a true ruler. He did not seek this crown. He did not wave it in their faces or threaten them. His presence alone, his deeds, compelled their loyalty. It was there we witnessed a rare harmony: House Mormont, House Serwyn, the remaining loyalists, and a crowd of wildlings in the courtyard. All it took was the realization that, in that hall, stood a figure who might shepherd them through the long night to come. To Jon's own astonishment, it was a moment that outstripped any dream or ambition he had. I remember how he glanced at Sansa, a silent question in his eyes, as if to say, "Are you certain it should be me?" Yet the North had spoken in that distinct, thunderous fashion that only the North can. From there, Jon moved with resolute purpose. Winterfell was a ruin in many respects, its walls battered by battles, its people scattered or impoverished. Jon poured himself into the labor of fortifying the castle and the surrounding lands, ordering weapons of dragonglass once we confirmed its potency. He sent ravens across the realm, imploring the other great houses to prepare for what the Citadel continued to deny or minimize. In those months, I traveled back to Old Town to gather what knowledge I could, leaving behind Gilly and Little Sam in Jon's care. In my studies, I uncovered the proof of Rhaegar Targaryen's secret annulment from Elia Martell and subsequent marriage to Lyanna Stark. The day I realized the import of those lines of text, nearly hidden among genealogies, I felt the breath leave my body. Jon was not merely a bastard, he was the true-born son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, the living embodiment of ice and fire. Yet how to reveal this information? Would it even matter to him, who had just been crowned king in the north by his own people? This puzzle weighed heavily on me. Gilly, sweet though she is, could not fully grasp the political implications. But she saw the tension in my face and tried to soothe me. I wrote a letter to Jon but never sent it, fearful that if the knowledge spread recklessly, it might tear the realm apart at a time when it needed unity more than truth. Only later would I tell Jon in person. And by then, so many other storms had broken upon us that the revelation felt both monumental and strangely moot. Jon's fateful choice to journey south, to meet Daenerys Targaryen in Dragonstone, was born of necessity. We needed her dragons to fight the Night King. The cost was Jon's public promise of fealty, an action that enraged some northern lords. They had just declared him their king, and now he risked that authority by traveling to a Targaryen queen whose father had once burned their grandfather and uncle. I recall the fury in their letters. We named him king in the north, not to bend the knee to a foreign invader. But Jon saw a bigger picture. The living must unite or all would be lost. Reports speak of Daenerys' own surprise at his refusal to bend the knee initially, of her curiosity about this northern king who seemed to value the threat of the White Walkers above all else. I do not think it was love at first sight. Rather, a meeting of two unyielding personalities who eventually recognized that cooperation was their only option. Yet, in that crucible of danger and shared purpose, a bond formed that would change the destiny of Westeros. They ventured together beyond the wall to capture a White, a mission as desperate as any I have ever heard of. Jon lost good men there, including some of Daenerys' own advisors, and they witnessed the death and resurrection of Viserion, one of Daenerys' dragons, at the hands of the Night King. That alone was enough to sow terror in even the bravest hearts. How do you fight an undead dragon? But they returned with their prize. A writhing, broken corpse that could make even the hardest lords recoil in horror. The subsequent meeting at the Dragon Pit in King's Landing was meant to rally all factions. Cersei Lannister, the Martells, the Tyrell remnants, the Ironborn, against the threat of the dead. History will record that gathering as fraught with tension, brimming with ancient grudges and fresh animosity. But the spectacle of the undead silenced most arguments. Even Cersei feigned agreement, though we now know she had no intention of keeping her word. Regardless, Jon laid out the truth as plainly as a man could. If the living did not band together, the living would be lost. When they returned north, time was growing short. The army of the dead had smashed through the wall at Eastwatch using the blue flames of the reanimated Viserion. Panic spread through the north, even as Daenerys arrived with her forces. I arrived from the Citadel around that time, having convinced a few of my fellow maesters to at least open their eyes to the threat. We began stockpiling dragon glass, forging weapons day and night in the forges of Winterfell. The lords from the Riverlands, the Vale, and even some from the Westerlands who had split from Cersei's cause came trickling in. Winterfell became an armed camp. Every available inch of ground was used to house soldiers, free folk, and refugees fleeing the undead. Jon, though wearied by his many trials, never ceased coordinating defenses, conferring with Ser Davos, Tormund, Arya, and Sansa at all hours. I remember noticing lines on his face that had not been there even a year earlier, the slow transformation from a youthful warrior to a careworn leader. The Battle of Winterfell itself requires many pages to detail fully. I offer only my vantage. The night was impenetrably dark, the sky heavy with clouds. Even the moon seemed to vanish as if refusing to witness the horrors about to unfold. I stood upon the battlements, trembling despite the layers of furs I wore, and tried to keep track of the positions we had prepared. Thousands of Unsullied formed the first line, the Dothraki stood ready with their arcs lit by Melisandre's conjurations, and the Northern Banner men formed ranks behind them. The Free Folk, too, were scattered among them while the Vale Knights guarded the flank. Sansa and many of the non-combatants were secured in the crypts below, though that proved to be less safe than we had imagined. Daenerys and Jon took to the skies on 2 dragons, attempting to spot the army of the dead before it reached our lines. But the swirling snow and unnatural wind made it nearly impossible. Then the wave of undead collided with us and all was chaos. I could hear the shrieks of dying men, the roars of dragons. The ground shook beneath the pounding mass of wights. We fought for what felt like hours, though it might have been less or more. Time itself seemed to distort in that horror. Jon fought valiantly, at times dismounting Regal to defend pockets of men who were overwhelmed. He shouted orders lost in the din, always seeking the Night King. In glimpses I caught of him, he looked more like a figure from old songs than any mortal man I had ever known, white wolf hair plastered to his forehead by sweat and snow, eyes aflame with determination. Longclaw swinging in arcs that severed limbs and shattered undead skulls. The shrill call of wights drowned out all else. There were moments I feared we had already lost, that the dead would simply keep coming, pushing us back into the inner wards, then the Great Hall, then the crypts, and that would be the end of the living. But at the height of that terror, Arya Stark's dagger found the Night King at the Godwood. The White Walkers shattered, their undead thralls collapsing in heaps of motionless corpses. A sudden hush blanketed the battlefield. We had prevailed. Yet in that hush lay immense sorrow. The corpses of our friends, family, and allies littered every corner of Winterfell, and the walls were blackened by dragon fire. Jon, discovering the death toll, wore a face of profound grief and exhaustion. He found time to embrace Sansa and Arya to ensure they were safe, but any hint of triumph was overshadowed by the magnitude of what we had endured. In a more perfect story, that victory would have brought lasting peace. But the thirst for the Iron Throne remained, and Daenerys felt compelled to press her claim upon the South, believing that her assistance in saving the realm had earned her the right to rule it. Jon had already bent the knee, though many northern lords still resented this. Tensions ran high. It was in those days of precarious calm that I finally shared with Jon what I had discovered in Old Town, that he was Aegon Targaryen, the true-born son of Rhaegar and Lyanna. He received the news as though I had struck him across the face. Stunned, disbelieving at first, then quietly horrified. He felt it undermined his entire identity as a Stark in all but name. Worse, he foresaw the rift it would cause with Daenerys, who had fought so hard to reclaim her birthright. Indeed, the knowledge festered between them, and though Jon never claimed the Iron Throne for himself, the very fact of his lineage cast Daenerys' legitimacy into question in the eyes of some. Whispers spread, the true king rides in our ranks, yet pretends to be a mere warden of the north. Daenerys grew agitated, suspicious, and as she marched south, her armies diminished by the losses at Winterfell, her state of mind grew strained. The final tragedy unfolded in King's Landing. The city, long suffering under the manipulations of Cersei Lannister, was on edge. Daenerys demanded unconditional surrender, but Cersei refused, using civilians as human shields. Jon pleaded for a peaceful resolution, but the fear and rage that burned in Daenerys ignited into madness when the city's bells tolled in surrender. She unleashed dragonfire upon the streets, incinerating soldiers and innocents alike. The horror that so many of us had just escaped in the north now found a twisted reflection in the scorched rubble of the capital. Men, women, and children fled, trapped in crumbling houses and blazing alleyways. Jon stood amid the carnage, desperately trying to halt the slaughter. That day, the hero who had faced the army of the dead met an evil that was all too human and found it no less terrifying. When the ash settled, countless lives were lost and the city lay in ruin. Daenerys stood amid the wreckage, the Targaryen banner raised over the Red Keep. Whatever love Jon felt for her warred with his horror at what she had done. I do not think it was an easy decision, nor one made in cold calculation when he confronted her in the throne room, the Iron Throne looming behind her like a black silhouette. She spoke of liberation by fire, of forging a new world from the ashes of the old. Jon, tears in his eyes, pleaded for mercy, for a kinder rule. She would not yield. In that moment, he recognized that to save what remained of Westeros, he must strike down the one he loved. With a final whispered apology, he plunged his dagger into her heart. That act shattered Jon. He did not cry out in triumph or vengeance. He held her as she died, whispering words no one else will ever know. Perhaps he spoke of regret, perhaps of love. Then Drogon, her last dragon, arrived in a fury of flame and sorrow, yet did not kill Jon. Instead, it destroyed the Iron Throne, melting that ancient seat of power into molten slag. The symbolic significance of that moment reverberates through every corner of our history. The throne that had driven so many to cruelty and madness was undone by the very creature that symbolized Targaryen might. Drogon took Daenerys' body and vanished into the eastern sky. Jon, left behind, surrendered himself to the uncertain justice of the new powers that assembled in the aftermath. The lords and ladies who survived, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Tyrion Lannister, Davos Seaworth, and others, gathered in the Dragon Pit to decide the future of Westeros. They named Bran Stark as king, believing his gift of sight and neutrality would guide the realm to peace. As for Jon, he was condemned to rejoin the Night's Watch, an institution resurrected in name, though it was but a shadow of its former self. The notion that the realm still needed a place to send the unwanted, criminals, bastards, and undesirables, revealed that we had not learned all of the lessons we should have from so much bloodshed. Yet it was a political compromise that prevented further war. Jon, bowed by grief and guilt, accepted his fate without protest. He returned north once more, eventually leading a band of free folk beyond the wall, seeking, perhaps, some semblance of peace among the snows and ancient pines. Here, in these pages, I wish to speak plainly. I believe Jon's exile was an injustice, a choice born more of necessity than fairness. The man who had saved the realm from the long night, who had brought together the North and the free folk, who had risked all to prove the existence of the undead, who had even sacrificed his own heart's desire to prevent further tyranny. This man was sent to the edge of the known world. Some might argue it was fitting that Jon belonged to the North as much as the wolves and the winter winds. But it stings me still that the realm he fought so hard to save could not find room for him in its new order. On the other hand, perhaps that was the only outcome that would allow him any measure of inner peace, however fleeting. Had Jon been thrust upon the throne or burdened with some grand station, he might never have found release from the constant pressures that had shaped his life. And so he left the trappings of power behind, going where the politics of lords and ladies held no sway, where he could walk among the free folk and watch the sun rise over endless drifts of untouched snow. In the years since, we have rebuilt. King Bran, dubbed Bran the Broken, has ruled with an enigmatic calm. The North, under Queen Sansa, has found an independent peace. Arya sailed west, chasing horizons unknown, determined to discover what lay beyond the edge of our maps. The old cycles of war have, for now, quieted. And yet, the essence of Jon remains woven into the tapestry of the realm's memory. It is my mission that we never forget him, not as some footnote or a cautionary tale, but as the embodiment of what true honor can accomplish when it refuses to be stifled by cynicism. Jon's story, from the windswept courtyard of Castle Black to the final heartbreak in the Red Keep, is one of unwavering moral fortitude in a realm defined by shifting loyalties and ambition. I find myself reflecting on how the small folk speak of him. On my travels to record these final testimonies, I visited hamlets in the Reach and villages on the edge of the Vale. They do not recite the lineages or the minute details of battles, nor do they dwell on the intricacies of Jon's Targaryen blood. They speak of the White Wolf, the man who stood against the dead, who saved them from a darkness they might never fully understand. Some swear they glimpsed him in the sky atop a dragon, others claim he still roams the woodlands of the north with a giant white wolf at his side. My academic mind dismisses many of these as half-truths or expansions of rumor, but there is a kernel of awe in each telling. Jon's legacy transcends the pedantry of genealogical records. It lives in the relief of mothers who no longer fear an undead horde snatching their babes in the night. In the fireside tales told by old soldiers who recall the night the living and dead clashed beneath the northern stars. All of this cements my conviction that when we recount the histories of the great wars and rulers, we must give Jon his rightful place, not merely as a supporting figure to the likes of Daenerys Targaryen or to the Wars of Kings, but as a central axis around which the fate of the realm turned. Without him, the White Walkers might well have swept away every last kingdom of men. Without him, the free folk would have remained, bitter enemies picking away at the North's defenses. Without him, Daenerys might never have come north in time to face the undead, and the realm would have fractured into petty squabbles as the Night King carved through helpless villages. Jon was the glue that, however tenuously, bound us together during the most critical juncture in our history. And if the realm did not offer him a crown or a comfortable estate at the conclusion, that speaks more to the complicated tapestry of power than to his worthiness. Perhaps, in his heart of hearts, Jon never wanted such things. He wanted only to protect those who could not protect themselves, to live by the simple code he learned as a boy under the eye of Eddard Stark, and then to fade into the quiet snows of the north. Some nights, alone in my study, I revisit every scrap of parchment, every letter or statement from those who knew him best. The accounts from Tormund Giantsbane are especially telling. Though Tormund's words might be riddled with expletives and wry humor, his admiration for Jon shines through. The lad was too serious for his own good, Tormund wrote to me once, but you could trust him. No matter the storm, no matter the enemy, you knew he'd not run away or betray you. From Davos Seaworth, I glean a similar sentiment. Jon's honesty was almost a fault in a world that thrives on double talk and politicking. Davos admired that Jon was straightforward even to his own detriment. From Brienne of Tarth, who served under Sansa Stark, I glean that while her loyalty lay primarily with the Stark girls, she recognized that Jon carried the best of Ned Stark's qualities, shaped by a resilience that came from surviving the scorn of bastardy. And from Sansa herself, in a letter to me years later, she confided that without Jon, she might never have escaped the horrors of Ramsay Bolton nor found the strength to claim her own crown in the north. In every dimension of this story, Jon emerges not as a man angling for power, but as one who stepped into the role that events demanded of him. Did he make mistakes? Undoubtedly. He often underestimated the treachery that men will stoop to when threatened. He believed too strongly in open communication even when secrecy might have served him better. He put himself at risk again and again, relying on a sense of honor and fairness in a realm where both are scarce commodities. Yet is that not precisely why we must celebrate him? He was a singular light in a landscape darkened by political games, betrayals, and centuries of unresolved grudges. Even now, so many years later, the question of whether Jon might someday return from beyond the wall stirs the imaginations of bards and storytellers. Some say that if the dead were ever to rise again, he would lead the free folk south to stand against them once more. Others whisper he may have ventured east of the Shivering Sea in search of a rumored land, carrying with him the memory of Ygritte's laughter and the burdens of too many fallen comrades. Still others claim he has found a quiet vale in the far north where ancient weirwoods stand silent, and he lives there in peace among the wildlings, teaching their children how to track game and survive the harsh winters without fear. We cannot say for certain. The last I heard of him was years ago, an offhand sighting near the Fist of the First Men, where a group of travelers claimed a tall figure in black furs guided them away from danger. True or apocryphal, the story felt apt. Jon, an ever-watchful guardian who appears and vanishes as needed, leaving behind only gratitude and a renewed sense of safety. The Citadel might prefer a more definitive conclusion, a firm date of death, or an official record of exile. But part of the power of Jon's legacy lies in its open-endedness. He walks in the realm of myth as much as in recorded history, bridging that gap between the ephemeral nature of legends and the stark reality of the world. He was born of ice and fire, shaped by swords and heartbreak, and anointed by duty in a manner that few men ever experience. If he is to vanish into the snows, then so be it. Perhaps that is the realm's final gift to a man who gave everything he had. In my continuing efforts to chronicle his tale, I speak not only of battles and alliances but also of the quieter virtues, how he comforted a grieving mother in a small village near the Gift, how he personally tended to the wounded after the skirmish at the Bridge of Skulls, how he paused mid-journey to ensure a frightened child found food and warmth. Those stories rarely make it into the official annals of kings and lords, yet they paint a portrait of a leader whose moral center was as unwavering as the oldest heart tree. We do the realm a great disservice if we omit these details, for they remind us that the greatest kings or queens are not always those who wield power most ruthlessly, but those who embody compassion in the face of cruelty. And so I leave this expanded account for future eyes. If you, dear reader, peruse these words in the quiet halls of the Citadel or in the solar of some distant keep, I beseech you to hold them dear. Long after my bones have turned to dust and these parchments have faded, may the truth of Jon's life endure. He was the shield that guarded the realms of men, the friend to the friendless, the unifier of enemies. He faced dragons, White Walkers, and the savage thirst for power in mortal hearts, and he did so with a determination that saved thousands upon thousands of lives. Though he was never comfortable in the role of king, the realm saw him as such, and if he ultimately traded that crown for exile, that only underscores the depth of his sacrifice. I have no illusions that these words will remain unchallenged. Some will say I am a biased narrator, that I loved Jon as a brother and therefore painted him in too flattering a light. Others might claim that Daenerys Targaryen or Arya Stark or even King Bran were the true heroes. But if you sift through the sources, if you trace the lines of cause and effect, you will see that time and again, Jon's hand shaped the crucial decisions that led us through the Valley of Death. He was the voice that insisted we must unite, the sword that held against the greatest horrors of the night, and the conscience that would not be silenced by the allure of dominion. Perhaps the children of future winters will find in his story the inspiration to band together when new darkness arises. Perhaps the name Jon Snow or Aegon Targaryen will become synonymous with both resilience and humility. Our realm is scarred by centuries of bloodshed, but in every scar there is a lesson. The lesson of Jon is that the realm's survival depends not on any single house's victory but on an unbreakable commitment to the living, no matter their name or birth. If the White Walkers taught us anything, it is that the petty lines drawn on our maps crumble when faced with a true existential threat. Jon's legacy is that he recognized this sooner than most and acted upon it even when it cost him everything. Often, I conclude these recollections by imagining the future that might have been if people had listened to him earlier, if the realm had not been consumed by the War of the Five Kings, if the Night's Watch had rallied behind him instead of stabbing him in the dark, if Daenerys had curbed her rage in King's Landing. But these ifs do nothing to change what transpired. Instead, I record them so that we remember how a single choice, made by a few, can save or condemn countless lives. We are all stewards of the future, tasked with learning from our mistakes. Jon, in his humility, never claimed to be anything more than another watcher on the walls of civilization. But his watch shaped the fates of us all. So let this final testament stand as both a history and an homage. Jon's footprints stretch across the icy wastes beyond the wall, across the blood-soaked fields of Winterfell, and into the hearts of those who saw him stand against an impossible tide. If there is poetry in the gods' design, it is that the man called Snow, dismissed at first as an inconvenient bastard, would unite the realm and fight to the bitter end for a cause larger than himself. We owe it to him to remember that no matter our birth, we too can rise to meet the gravest challenges if we hold to a code of compassion and duty. I, Samwell Tarly, affix my name to this expanded account with the hope that in reading it no soul can doubt the depth of Jon's impact upon us all. May he find peace in the wild, wide north among the free folk who love him as truly as any brother. May we honor his memory by ensuring that these pages illuminate the path forward so that no shadow of ignorance or old hatred can again blind us to what truly matters. And if you, gentle reader, should find yourself standing on the battlements of Castle Black in some future winter when the wind howls and the darkness grows deep, recall Jon's name. Let it shine like a beacon of hope in a realm that is ever so prone to forgetting its brightest lights. For he was and shall always remain the shield that guarded the realms of men. I do not write these additional words as a mere supplement or coda to what I have already set down, but rather as a continued unfolding of the legacy that Jon bestowed upon Westeros. The more time I spend reflecting, the more it seems that those who survive him, myself included, stand at the gateway of a new era, its foundation shaped largely by his actions. Though some might claim his story concluded the moment he rode beyond the wall, in truth, that moment was but a single step in the enduring imprint he left on the hearts of all who crossed his path. I find that I cannot cease the telling of him, for each time I put aside my quill, a fresh recollection or whispered anecdote comes drifting to me, carried by the ravens or shared by travelers who pass beneath the citadel's towering spires. In assembling these further writings, I hope to capture more facets of his life and aftermath, to weave a tapestry so broad that even the harshest skeptic must acknowledge the extraordinary measure of the man. In the months after King Bran's coronation and Jon's departure, Westeros languished in an uneasy peace. The devastation of King's Landing still smoldered in memory, its populace struggled to rebuild crumbled walls and bury the heaps of rubble that had once been homes. Down every street and broken alley you could find whispered accounts of the other Targaryen, the one who had killed the queen. No one in the city had a clear story, so rumor filled every gap. Some insisted he was a traitor and a butcher, twisting the truth of Daenerys' final descent. Others, perhaps those who had witnessed the dragonfire raining indiscriminately, called Jon a tragic savior forced to bear a guilt not fully his own. In an odd way, the chaos of rumor only amplified his story, spreading it far beyond the Red Keep's blackened remains. Yet, even the talk of the Mad Queen's final day was dwarfed by the sense of collective relief that the terror of the White Walkers was done. The lords who had gathered in the Dragon Pit to name Bran king found themselves tasked with a different kind of rule, one that demanded reconstruction instead of conquest. When I traveled briefly from the Citadel to King's Landing to see how the new small council operated, I found a realm still grappling with the magnitude of what had transpired. The steps of the Red Keep were scorched, a wing of the ancient structure had collapsed under the weight of dragonfire. I heard the ring of hammers day and night as builders toiled to shore up the breach. Tyrion Lannister, appointed Hand of the King, wore a face more grave than I had ever seen, consumed by the monumental duty of stitching Westeros back together. In those council sessions I witnessed men and women referencing Jon as though he were an almost mythic figure. Lord Gendry Baratheon, newly legitimized and set to oversee the Stormlands, recalled how Jon had risked everything to show the Seven Kingdoms the threat of the dead. Ser Davos Seaworth, who had now taken up a seat of influence near the king, spoke of Jon's unwavering code of honor, recounting how it sometimes clashed with cunning politics but saved countless lives. Every mention of him had a certain reverence, even from those who recognized the complicated nature of his final act. I believe many realized, too late, that the realm's deeper salvation had come not just from dragonfire or cunning, but from that quiet, steady presence who had steered us all to face what truly mattered. Meanwhile, the North faced its own epic of transition. Sansa Stark, crowned queen in the North, took charge of Winterfell with a resolve reminiscent of her mother, Catelyn. Though much of the castle had been repaired after the Battle of the Bastards and the war against the dead, the scars remained in pitted ramparts, scorched timbers, and the occasional piece of shattered stone that even skilled masons could not entirely replace. Yet the people there had grown used to scarcity and hardship. The wars and the extended winter had taught them resilience, and under Sansa's rule there was a palpable desire to ensure that the North would never again be caught unprepared. I traveled north that season to speak with her directly, to share what knowledge I had gained in the Citadel about more effective crop rotation and greenhouse methods, in the hope that these might stave off future famine. She had me ushered into the great hall where fresh rushes lined the floor and a small gathering of courtiers listened attentively. I sensed that, despite her newly minted status, Sansa was still very much shaped by the tragedies that had befallen her and her family. One afternoon I asked her how she recalled Jon. She paused with a far-off look and said that though the realm had hailed him king in the North, he had always believed her more suited to rule. Her words hinted at a deep mutual respect, but also at the heartbreak she felt that he had vanished beyond the wall, never to witness the North flourish under her care. When I left the North, the roads were no longer haunted by the threat of whites or roving warbands. Instead, I encountered caravans of merchants from across the narrow sea, come to see if Westeros might still be a place to sell their wares. And as I ventured further south, I found pockets of small folk rebuilding or repurposing old structures. Barns once used as stables for warhorses were turning into communal storehouses or meeting halls. In each place I stopped, I made a point of asking if they had heard of Jon, the White Wolf, or the man called Snow. In many hamlets, the villagers spun me stories that varied in outlandish detail. Some insisted he was half-wraith, cursed to wander until the last star fell, because he had died and returned once already. Others claimed he could speak to the dire wolves in the forests and that, on cold nights, you could hear their mournful howls echoing over the hills, as though searching for him. A few of the more pious folk cast him in a near-divine light, seeing in his resurrection proof that he had been chosen by the gods to free them from the grip of eternal winter. Through it all, I kept my silence regarding his Targaryen parentage, uncertain whether such knowledge would incite new divisions or simply spur more imaginative legends. Still, the realm's memory of him continued to expand. In the Riverlands, I met an old soldier who had fought in the War of the Five Kings and later joined the Lannisters' cause by compulsion. The soldier showed me a scar across his cheek, a keepsake from the Battle of the Bastards when he fought under a Sellsword company in Ramsay Bolton's pay. "I saw snow," the man said, spitting into the grass. "Never saw a man fight like that. He was in the thick of it, arrow after arrow hissing by. He never so much as flinched. Some men have to bellow commands to be heard. But him? One look, and you'd follow him straight into the maw of the stranger." The soldier did not seem overly sentimental, but even he bore a grudging respect for Jon's conduct. I listened carefully, taking note of the man's recollection, how it confirmed the quiet authority I had always known in Jon, an authority that flowed not from titles but from an unshakable sense of purpose. Further east, near the Vale, I spoke with knights loyal to Lord Robin Arryn, who had grown from a sickly boy into a youth who aspired to reclaim the Vale's prestige. Some of these knights had ridden out with the cavalry that saved Jon from annihilation by the Bolton host. They remembered how he emerged from under a heap of bodies, his face streaked with sweat and blood, gasping for air like a man dragged from drowning. One knight told me, "Never seen anyone so determined to keep breathing, to keep going, as if giving up was a concept he didn't understand." Over cups of ale, he recounted how they found Jon standing alone in the mud, hopelessly outnumbered, yet refusing to so much as inch away from the fight. The knight shook his head, as though still amazed that any mortal man could be so fixed on a singular cause. I made my notes on these testimonies, preserving them in the form of small scrolls that would one day complement my main manuscript. It is worth noting that in many of these conversations, folk did not speak of Jon simply as a skilled swordsman or a rightful heir. What they stressed time and again was that he inspired them to act better than they might have otherwise. "I didn't want to kill wildlings," said a veteran of the watch I encountered on the road near Mole's Town. "Mida said wildlings were animals, no better than beasts. But Jon told me different, and I saw with my own eyes how they cried and bled and fought to protect their kin. Same as us. Changed how I saw the world. Made me realize you can't judge a man for his place of birth." Another soldier, a woman from the free folk who had taken service under Queen Sansa, spoke of how Jon had ensured she was given a fair wage and recognized as a warrior, not just a savage. Small gestures, done with no fanfare, yet each one reverberated through lives that had been taught to fear or despise each other. In these recollections, I glimpsed how Jon's example outlasted him, seeding the realm with a flicker of compassion that might, if nurtured, grow into something far greater. Upon returning to the Citadel, I devoted myself to expanding the archives that concern Jon and the wars of our era. I convinced a few of my fellow maesters, including Maester Abrose and Maester Wolken, to contribute their own gleanings from the reports sent by lords across the realm. We compiled casualty lists from the Battle of the Bastards, documented free folk migration patterns into the Gift, and transcribed the sworn statements from knights present at King's Landing during Daenerys' final assault. These tasks demanded rigorous cross-checking, for in the confusion of war, many details become muddled. Yet each line of verified fact added to the foundation upon which I could layer this more personal narrative of Jon's life. Some maesters balked at my approach. "We record history, not epics," declared one man who had served the Citadel since the days of Robert's Rebellion. "But what is history if not the stories of people who changed the world? And if an epic such as Jon's can be told with fidelity to truth, then let it be both history and moral compass for those who follow." During my research, I also uncovered letters addressed to Jon from individuals long thought lost. One, penned by Mira Reed, told him of her departure from Winterfell after the White Walker's defeat, thanking him for his role in protecting Bran. She hinted at regrets. "I wish my brother Joe." Jen had seen the day the Night King fell, for he foretold of a champion with both ice and fire in his veins. Another letter from a blacksmith in the Westerlands offered to forge a new sword for Jon once the realm was at peace, that he might wield a blade free of the burdens of the Night's Watch. Of course, these letters were never delivered, sealed, and unsent. They remain in the Citadel's archives, poignant reminders of how many reached out to him in gratitude, friendship, or hope that he might guide them further. Each missive offers a glimpse of how deeply his efforts resonated across classes and regions. Now and again, I received word from the north that Tormund Giant's Bane and the free folk were settling deeper into the tundra, chasing the promise of game and unoccupied land. Occasionally, a black brother traveling from Castle Black down to the New Gift would pass me a rumor. "The Lord Commander says there's been talk of a figure leading the wildlings, a man with dark hair and a white wolf ever at his side." One such traveler insisted the figure had aided in driving off an ice bear that threatened a wildling camp, saving a family of 5. But none could say for certain if it was truly Jon. The ghost stories that swirl around him beyond the wall are manifold. Some claim he wanders with the spirits of old kings in the cryptic forests, while others suggest he lives a quiet life as a hunter, teaching free folk children how to set snares and respect the old gods. While I cannot verify these tales, my heart finds comfort in imagining that he still moves through that harsh, boundless land, not alone but among people who accept him freely, unburdened by crowns or conspiracies. In the nights when my duties at the Citadel ease and I can slip into the quiet of a secluded chamber, I sometimes correspond with Bran the Broken. Our raven exchanges are infrequent, for the king's time is precious and my tasks at the Citadel also pile high. Yet whenever I pen a letter, I cannot help but wonder if, in his peculiar, far-seeing way, Bran keeps some watchful awareness of Jon's whereabouts. On rare occasions, Bran's replies include cryptic lines that suggest as much. "The north is vast, yet the footprints of memory remain," he wrote once. That was all. I read and reread those words, trying to decipher whether he meant to reassure me of Jon's safety or simply muse on the nature of time and recollection. Bran's transformation into the three-eyed raven has made him difficult to parse with ordinary human logic. Still, I suspect he knows far more than he conveys, perhaps believing that each living soul must find its own path to acceptance, its own way of remembering or letting go. Over the course of my continued research, I made a point to piece together every scrap of knowledge about Jon's childhood. Even though the truth of his parentage was known to so very few, I found an aging retainer from Winterfell who recalled how Eddard Stark returned from the war and placed a dark-haired babe in the care of the castle's nurses. Never giving more than a terse explanation, "This is my son." The retainer claimed that Ned Stark's manner was so stoic, so determined that no one dared question him directly. From that day on, the child was treated with civility but never quite belonged. I cannot read or hear these stories without an ache in my chest, for all that Jon accomplished was, in some sense, set upon a foundation of quiet loneliness. By the time he reached Castle Black, he had grown used to the notion that he was an outsider, that his presence was perpetually half-welcome. This vantage gave him empathy for others in exile, wildlings, bastards, and the dispossessed. And so it was that what had been a wound became a virtue, forging in him the capacity to stand for those whom the realm had too often cast aside. I found myself delving further back in time, tracing the line of Rhaegar Targaryen, a prince known for his love of song and prophecy, for his fascination with the promised prince who would deliver the world from darkness. How strange and fateful that the child who arose from that lineage, the union of Targaryen and Stark, would fulfill the role Rhaegar so ardently believed in, albeit in a way no one could have predicted. A man who was both the embodiment of the realm's two strongest forces, ice in his Stark blood, fire in his Targaryen heritage, and yet belonged fully to neither. Perhaps only such an individual could have transcended the division and suspicion that define our lords and kingdoms. This notion of him being some prophesied savior, though, never sat easily with Jon himself. Had he lived in a time free of cataclysm, he might well have chosen a simpler life altogether, some quiet corner of the north, a small household to protect, a warm hearth. But the gods or fate cast him into the storm. And if we glean any lesson from this, it is that the greatest among us often do not seek that title. Over the passing seasons, the realm's attitude toward him crystallized into legend. In the Westerlands, I learned bards had taken to calling him the Ghost King, weaving tunes about how he rose from death and returned from the long night to champion the living. These songs typically end with him marching off into the wasteland, never to be seen again, but promising that if the cold darkness ever descended anew, he would return. Meanwhile, in The Reach, traveling shows recount the Battle of the Bastards with a flourish of drama, painting Ramsay Bolton as a cackling devil and Jon as an avenging angel. Of course, these versions are rife with embellishments. Some even claim Jon rode a dire wolf the size of an aurochs into the fray. Such allusions make me smile, for though we both know Ghost is large for a wolf, he is far from a mythical beast. But I do not begrudge people these legends. They help them cope with the horrors we have endured and find hope in the idea that there are still good men in the world. Not all voices are so kind. In Dorne, I found some holdouts for a prince of Targaryen blood who felt betrayed by Jon's rejection of the throne. If he was truly Rhaegar's son, one Dornish noblewoman argued, then he should have pressed his right to restore the Targaryen dynasty, especially after Daenerys fell. But that was never Jon's way. Even if he had had the slightest interest in sitting the Iron Throne, the memory of King's Landing burning would have haunted him too deeply. I explained this as best I could, asserting that a crown was the furthest thing from his heart. The noblewoman snorted in disdain, but perhaps even that reaction illustrated how different Jon was. He was uninterested in playing the game of power that so many considered paramount. As the realm settled into the uneasy calm of King Bran's governance, I found that the citadel itself was evolving, if slowly. My own position was stronger than it once had been, my knowledge of the war against the dead lending me a credibility no one could deny. Those who once scoffed at the idea of White Walkers now stood in the shadow of undeniable proof. So, I used this influence to push for a more open-minded approach to learning, urging my fellow maesters to study the histories of the Children of the Forest, the old magic, and the possibility of other supernatural threats that might lie dormant beyond our borders. I argued that if we could so thoroughly miss the rise of the Night King, then what else might we be failing to see? In these debates, I often cited Jon as our guiding example, a man who faced the unimaginable and refused to dismiss it simply because it defied tradition or belief. Through it all, Gilly remained by my side, sometimes listening to me read aloud the newest pages of my manuscript, sometimes offering her own memories. She recalled her first impressions of Jon at Craster's Keep, how he seemed at once apprehensive and protective, how he questioned Craster's vile treatment of his own daughters, and how he, nearly alone among us, never turned away from the sight of Gilly carrying her child as though we were an embarrassment. To Jon, every life mattered, even if that life came from a place as reviled as Craster's. Some nights, Gilly would comment that Jon reminded her of a figure from the old stories that the free folk mothers told their children, the hero who stands in the gap between the living and the deadly cold of eternal winter. I think of that often when I see her put little Sam to bed, humming soft lullabies that ring with the cadences of the far north. Jon's example filters into these lullabies, reminding the child that, no matter how cruel the world becomes, there are those who stand vigil. Perhaps that alone is enough to ensure the next generation grows up with a kinder view of unity and compassion. In time, my transcription of new histories expanded into an entire wing within the Citadel's library dedicated to the War of the Five Kings, the return of the Targaryen Queen, the Long Night's Second Coming, and the Final Resolution. Within those shelves, I curated manuscripts from other maesters who documented each major battle and turning point. But my own volumes, 10 in total, focus on Jon's role. I have included statements from Davos, Brienne, Arya, Bran, Tormund, and others who survived to speak of him. I have inserted maps that show his journeys from Winterfell to the Wall, from Harhome to Eastwatch, from Dragonstone to beyond the Wall again, culminating in his final presence in King's Landing and the subsequent trail leading back north. I have also included genealogical charts that place him as the legitimate son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, though, at Bran's request, I concealed these charts behind coded references. He did not forbid me from recording the truth, but he advised caution in broadcasting it openly. King Bran, in his cryptic way, said that some truths are better unearthed by future generations rather than forced upon a world still reeling from war. I listened, for I trust his judgment. The time may come when that lineage no longer poses a risk of sparking conflict, when the realm is stable enough to embrace the fact without it igniting fresh ambition. Until then, the knowledge rests in carefully guarded volumes. I feel compelled to mention, too, the heartbreaks that peppered Jon's path, for they shaped him as much as any victory. There was Ygritte's death, which taught him the personal cost of duty. There was the betrayal by his brothers of the Watch, which seared into him the realization that even those who vow loyalty can be misled by fear. There was the burden of leadership in the Battle of the Bastards, where he saw countless men perish to right a wrong the North had suffered under the Boltons. And finally, there was the necessity of Daenerys' death, which tore his soul in half. In my earlier chapters, I recounted these events in straightforward detail, but I did not fully explore how each one, in its own way, made him more empathetic to suffering. I see it clearly now. Every wound, every betrayal, carved out more space in him for understanding and compassion. That is not to say he was fragile. On the contrary, heartbreak tempered him like steel in a forge. Each new agony shaped him into the figure we came to know at the end, someone who knew he must act for the greater good, no matter how much it cost him personally. That is a form of heroism that songs rarely capture, for they prefer shining moments of valor to the slow, relentless crush of sorrow that fosters a profound moral compass. As I continued gathering these threads, I sometimes found myself drawn to the old godwood in Old Town. Though the weirwood there is no match for the ancient ones in the north, it still holds a faint echo of the same hush. Standing before it, I would close my eyes and, in my mind's eye, picture Jon in the godwood at Winterfell, his hand resting on the cold trunk, silently communing with the old gods whose faces are carved there. Perhaps he found solace in those quiet moments, a safe space from the demands of lords and armies. Maybe beyond the wall, he lives among those same old gods, letting the wind in the pines serve as his only counsel. Whenever I linger too long on that image, I feel a tug of yearning. We all ache for resolution, for the comforting knowledge that he has found some measure of peace. The question arises often, if the realm were threatened again, could Jon return? The maesters of the Citadel debate it in the evening hours, sometimes with a hint of jest, sometimes with genuine interest. One says he died once for the watch, so perhaps the second death is the final. Another retorts, if the Red Woman's magic revived him once, who can say the flames would not answer again? I keep my silence in these debates, uncertain if such speculation does anything but cheapen the reality of his experience. Jon was not some undying hero or an elemental force. He was a man, flesh and blood, who bore the weight of the world's survival on his shoulders. The fact that he might never step foot south of the wall again seems, to me, as natural as the turning of the seasons. He has earned his rest from the conflicts of lords and ladies, from the endless cycle of ambition that calls men to kill one another. Still, I cannot deny that somewhere, in a hidden corner of my heart, I share their hope that if the shadows ever deepen again, we might look north and see the silhouette of a wolf and a man ready to shield us once more. It is here, in the final stage of these recollections, that I attempt to reconcile the conflicting images of Jon that swirl throughout Westeros. He is, to some, the heroic king in the north, to others, the reluctant Targaryen who should have claimed the throne, to still others, the turncloak of the Night's Watch who dared to let wildlings pass the wall. In the swirl of these perceptions, the only truth I hold certain is that Jon was guided by one unwavering principle, the protection of life. Whether it was protecting Gilly and her child from the horrors of Craster's Keep, forging an alliance with wildlings to spare them the undead, kneeling to Daenerys in exchange for her aid against the Night King, or ending her reign of terror to save thousands more. Every significant decision was anchored to that singular moral imperative. Perhaps that is what we should enshrine in history, not his name or titles, but the notion that a single good man, dedicated to preserving life, can shift the course of kingdoms more dramatically than any warlord or tyrant. I recall a parting conversation I once had with Jon after he learned of my plan to travel to the Citadel and become a maester. We stood on the ramparts of Castle Black, the wind whipping at our cloaks. I was nervous, excited, and somewhat guilty, for I felt I was abandoning him. He placed a hand on my shoulder, gazed at me with those solemn, gray eyes, and said, "It's all right, Sam. Someone has to learn the things we've forgotten. Someone has to keep the realm's memory alive." At the time, I did not grasp the full importance of those words. Now, I see that he was giving me a charge, urging me to ensure that knowledge remained our bulwark against the disasters that come when we repeat our worst mistakes. His story itself is part of that memory, an essential piece of the realm's living tapestry. And so I keep writing, keep gathering, keep preserving. It is, in its own way, the vow I swore to him that day. I have heard whispers that some lords in the Vale or the Reach harbor a desire to invite Jon back to lead them should King Bran's health fail, or if the realm falls into disorder again. Part of me wonders how he might respond if ever a raven reached him carrying such an entreaty. Would he scowl at the absurdity, as I imagine he would? Or would he regretfully reflect on the vow that cost him everything? Perhaps both, as so much of Jon's nature was shaped by internal conflicts. But I suspect the quiet life among the free folk would hold a greater appeal to him now than any seat of power in the southern lands. He has stared into the faces of war and death enough for 3 lifetimes. Let those who remain shoulder the responsibilities of crowns and councils. Sometimes Gilly will catch me in a moment of wistful reflection and chide me gently, saying, "You can't live in the past forever, Sam." I know she speaks the truth. Even so, the realm's future is indelibly linked to that past. What we choose to remember or forget will define whether we flourish or stumble into the same brutal mistakes. If we forget the lessons of Jon's life, if we bury them under the weight of new petty squabbles, we risk dooming ourselves to a cycle of ruin. That is why I intend for these pages to be more than a tribute. I intend them as a clarion call for unity, compassion, and vigilance, qualities Jon embodied when most of us were too distracted by old feuds to see the gathering storm. Let this stand, then, as the next layer of the living chronicle. There will be more to add, I am certain. Even as I write, new accounts might surface, or travelers might glimpse a wolfish silhouette in the farthest reaches of the north. Another maester, decades from now, could unearth some hidden letter or discover a new vantage on Jon's deeds. History is an ever-shifting mosaic, with each piece adding context to the last. But in the mosaic forming around Jon's story, the shape is already clear. He is the figure at the intersection of ice and fire, the man who put aside ambition to save the world, who overcame betrayal and heartbreak without surrendering to bitterness. He is the shield that stood against the onslaught of darkness. He is the friend who extended a hand to the friendless, the king who never wore his crown by choice, the Targaryen who never desired a throne. He is all these things and more. I suspect that in years to come, mothers will name their boys Jon, recalling the quiet fortitude with which he faced unspeakable odds. Perhaps in the halls of the great houses, new lords and ladies will toast to his memory when winter storms batter the walls, reminding themselves that once a single individual's unwavering courage held back the long night. And perhaps, in the citadel itself, novices poring over these volumes will come to an understanding that the line between legend and history is permeable, and a man can slip from one realm into the other by the sheer weight of his actions. Jon has done that. He belongs now to both the living record and the ephemeral domain of myths. In him, we find proof that one need not possess cunning beyond measure or an army of thousands to alter the fate of the world, only a resolute heart and a refusal to abandon hope in the face of terror. Thus I continue my testament, ensuring that Jon's memory remains accessible to all who seek it. It may be that some future threat will overshadow even the War of the Five Kings, that some new doom will test Westeros in ways we cannot yet imagine. Should that day come, I pray that the realm will recall how Jon saw beyond borders, beyond old hatreds, and galvanized the living to stand as one. The greatest tragedies in Westeros spring from our divisions, the greatest victories from unity. That is the simplest truth gleaned from Jon's path. I hold faith that if the realm remembers it, we can avoid the pitfalls that once nearly destroyed us. In closing these pages, I set my final reflections upon the parchment with a sense of solemn gratitude. If not for Jon, I would likely have perished at Craster's Keep or died a coward at Castle Black. If not for Jon, the free folk might have remained enemies, and countless thousands of innocents would have fallen to the army of the dead. If not for Jon, Winterfell might still lie under the Bolton's tyranny. If not for Jon, we might never have defeated the Night King nor realized the necessity of forging alliances across old lines of division. He changed my life as he changed the course of history. Now, let my words serve as one more heartbeat of memory in the grand song of our realm. I, Samwell Tarly, commit these lines to ink and parchment, that future generations might grasp the essence of the man who walked among us in our bleakest hour. He was no perfect saint, nor did he claim to be. He erred, he doubted, and he grieved. But in every trial, he chose to remain steadfast in his duty to the living. May the realm never forget the White Wolf, the king in the north, the reluctant Targaryen, the shield that guarded the realms of men. For in remembering him honestly, acknowledging his struggles as well as his triumphs, we find a standard of conduct that can guide us through any darkness. If ever you read these words under the shadow of doubt or despair, recall that Jon faced the literal darkness of the walking dead and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken in spirit. Such is the power of duty blended with compassion. Such is the force that can unify a fractured land. Let us honor him not with empty statues or half-true songs, but by carrying forward the better world he helped to make possible. That is how we do justice to his story, by living in such a way that his example becomes woven into our actions, a silent beacon that says, "This is how we fight the storms of winter, this is how we endure, and this is how we choose hope over surrender." Here ends the next volume of my ongoing account. Though I suspect the story itself goes ever on, in the hush of the northern forests and the hearts of those he saved. Should the ravens someday bring word of Jon's return or confirm a rumor of his final rest, I will dutifully record it. Until then, his legend roams free, as boundless as the snows beyond the wall and as persistent as the memory of warmth in the dead of winter. May the gods, old and new, and any that dwell in the flames or the trees, guard his path, just as he once guarded ours. And may these words keep the truth of him alive for as long as our libraries stand and quills can find parchment.